We are going to be taking a walk through my garden here. This is my home garden. If you have any questions, try to leave them below as we're walking through. I'm going to try to watch this. This is the first time I've done a live on YouTube, so we'll see how this goes. But I'd love to have you walk through the garden with me, and we'll be taking a look at all of the beautiful plants that are blooming here in my August garden. I am located in West Michigan. We are a gardening zone 5B, 6A. So let's go ahead and take a walk through the garden. So we're going to start off, I think right here is a nice place to start. Right now, I feel like people have a lot of questions on hydrangeas. What's blooming, how to trim them, that kind of thing. So we're going to just kind of start off and talk about some of the hydrangeas and such that are blooming. But as we walk past things, we'll also stop to talk about anything that's blooming. The first one we're going to start with, though, is the Tough Stuff hydrangea. So this is a button hydrangea, and right now there's not a lot of color going on. But the thing that is really cool about this hydrangea is about 6 weeks ago or so, this was absolutely loaded with blooms. The blooms have now been buried and new growth is emerging, and that's what you're seeing. And some of the flowers that you're seeing on the top here are new flowers from that new growth. So basically the Tough Stuff hydrangea flowered, buried its dead, and is now putting on another set of leaves, which will result in more flowers now and even a little bit later on in the season if our season is long enough. So we'll see if the season's long enough to give us a lot more blooms. Hi Erica, thanks for watching from Lansing. And hi Deanna. So the first thing that's really shout color now are the Rudbeckia. So these are the Rudbeckia Gold Stars. And one thing to point out with the Rudbeckia Gold Stars are they're clean. There's not black spots all over the leaves. So a lot of times in the garden, the flowers are beautiful, but the foliage is not clean. And this foliage is absolutely clean. Let's go in and take a closer look so you too can see for yourself. You are not seeing any black spots here on these Rudbeckia. Those of you who are new to the station, Garden Crossings is a retail garden center located in Zeeland, Michigan. We also have our mail order store, which is gardencrossings.com. So if there's any plants that you see in the garden that you're liking, you can head on over to either our retail store or our website where we'll ship them directly to your door. These hydrangeas here are the mini Mauvette hydrangeas. They were in their prime end of June, beginning of July. You can see there's one little fresh flower there on top to see the beautiful pink color. But a lot of the flowers are now spent blooms. But you'll notice I haven't trimmed any of these spent blooms back. I'm just leaving them there because I think even though they're spent, they still add a lot of interest to the garden. And from a distance, they really do look kind of more dusty rose. So still adding pretty pops of color into this garden space. Another gold star. So somebody says they're having a hard time getting their hydrangeas to turn blue with the Espoma acidic. Sometimes you just have to, sometimes you're fighting nature there, right? Here in West, I shouldn't even say that. As I say, in West Michigan, a lot of our hydrangeas are pink, although by the lakeshore they're blue. So it really does depend on the type of soil you're planting them into. And sometimes it'll take lots of applications to get the soil saturated enough to get them to turn blue and or pink if you're putting anything into the soil. Also too, it's not going to be an instant thing. So by putting it in the ground, it may take a year for it to absorb and soak in for the plants to be blue. So maybe next year you'll see blue hydrangeas, Becky, hopefully. There's a lot of coneflowers blooming right now in the garden, so they're looking really nice. My daughter and I this morning, we released about 200 monarch butterflies in our garden from the butterfly house at the greenhouse. So it's so fun to just kind of walk around the garden and see just a lot of monarchs on various plants. The hydrangeas we're looking at now are the Invincible Wee White hydrangeas. Again, smooth hydrangeas, part of the arborescent family. Bloomed more midsummer, the end of June, beginning of July. But these two I have not trimmed back because I think the spent blooms even look pretty nice just as they are. The nice thing with smooth hydrangeas is they bloom off of the new growth. So if you trim them really at any point in the fall or in the spring, you don't need to worry if they're going to bloom or not the following season. They will bloom off of that new growth. Another thing you're going to find in the garden is a lot of white. I like to plant white because I love how it just glows in the night. It gives really a very peaceful, calming feel in the garden at night. Think about a moon garden. It's just white really just kind of twinkles in the night. And white matches every color, so you can't go wrong with planting white in the garden. These here are sun patiens. They like to be grown in full sun. Pro tip, sun patiens do not like to be fertilized. If you fertilize your sun patiens, you're going to find that they really will diminish on flowers. So easy to care for in the sense of they don't need fertilizer, but they are a thirsty plant, so you do want to make sure that you keep them good and watered. Here's some Rebecca under the deck here. This garden here faces east, so it gets sun until about noon, and you can see these Rebecca's are doing good in that part shade type of situation. Probably one of the most talked about plants in my garden is the Alstroemeria. This is Alstroemeria Inca Ice, and this is one plant. This one plant has continued to create a larger clump year after year. Why do I like Alstroemeria? Alstroemeria is one of the longest blooming perennials in my garden. It starts blooming end of May and doesn't stop blooming until we get a good hard frost. It's an excellent cut flower, beautiful blooms. The flowers will last about 2 weeks if you do cut them and bring them in the house. So there's not a lot of perennials out there that bloom from early season until the fall. In the back there, you're seeing another hydrangea. That is a little quick fire hydrangea. The quick fire hydrangeas are some of the earliest to bloom and the earliest to present with their pink colors. It's a hardy hydrangea, panicle hydrangea. It blooms off of the new growth as well, so very reliable. More of a lace-capped flower form, so they still are the cone-shaped flowers. They're just not as big as some of the other hydrangeas we'll see in the garden today. Sorry about that. Kind of an iconic late summer blooming plant. This garden here basically has, I think, 4 plants in it. Limelight hydrangea, which is on a tree form or standard, which means it has a trunk. There is the Bloomerang dwarf purple hydrangea for spring color. There's my Monet Wagila, which is spring flower color, all summer foliage color. At last roses, and then we put some red sun patiens in. That way this garden is always blooming. So the Bloomerang dwarf purple hydrangeas, obviously their spring bloom is the most prolific, but look at here. You can see the flowers there. There's a few more flowers there. So to get a lot, I might have just called this a hydrangea. If I did, I apologize. To get a lilac to rebloom throughout the summer is really not a thing unless if you have the Bloomerang reblooming hydrangeas in the garden. The Atlas roses, there's a couple flowers here. These are kind of in their cycling state right now. Beautiful orange coloration. And it smells so good. There's not a lot of flowers, not a lot of roses on that, but man, it's just so fragrant. Heading out to the butterfly garden, and this is where we did the release this morning because there's a lot of Asclepias in this garden, as well as butterfly bush and Asclepias. The interesting thing though is the because I guess I just didn't anticipate they were going to head to the Bobos. So in this garden, when we planted it, we were really intentional about making sure that we had pollinator plants in this garden, especially Asclepias or milkweed, because that is the host plant for monarch caterpillars and butterflies. We have several different varieties of milkweed in here. We have Asclepias Cinderella, tuberosa, Hello Yellow, and I think it's called Milkmaid. And then we will occasionally pop some annual milkweed in as well, because annual milkweed creates a lot of foliage, which therefore is a lot of food for the caterpillars. Up front, we have coneflowers. These at one time were a whole bunch of different colors, but it's been several years, and now pretty much the pink variety has won out, with the exception of the one white variety. Here's a milkweed in front of us, and the milkweed is done flowering now, but there's a lot of seed pods, so we're gonna go ahead and let those dry. And once they kind of start to turn brown a little bit, I'll probably come in and harvest them. Number one, I don't want this garden to blow up with Asclepias. I mean, I'm okay with a few volunteers here and there, but I don't want it to take over this garden. So we'll collect the seeds, plant it up. That way we have milkweed for next year for in our butterfly house at the greenhouse. Some beautiful tall phlox. I think tall phlox is kind of a nice staple in a butterfly garden. Also gives a nice upright splash of color. The bobo hydrangeas are doing really fabulous. This whole garden we have lined with the white sun patiens. So from up from the house when we're looking at this, it's basically like we've created a frame that's framed in this bed. I've tried different colors in the years past and I have not loved it. So I continue to go back to the white. Here's a monarch butterfly. Just one of the ones that I'm seeing fluttering around right now. It's a female. How you can tell the difference is if this was a male, on either side of its body, there would be two round circles on the wings on either side of the body. So that's how you differentiate between if it's a male or a female in the monarch butterflies. This is the butterfly bush, Miss Molly. I love the color of Miss Molly. Right now this plant's about 5 foot tall, and look who's enjoying it. More monarchs. There's a couple of them on it right now. The nice thing with butterfly bush is there's such a beautiful fragrance to them. So as you're walking through the garden, you can just really smell the fragrance of the butterfly bush. And I personally think it's a great scent. Here is another bobo hydrangea. So if you're on right now, where are you watching from? I see we have one from Canada. That's great. I love to see when we're reaching all different countries. Spagula. This is Spagula Little Redhead. This is a native perennial. Really unique coloration. Bright red flowers, that little yellow center. This is rebloomed in the garden. Great plant for the hummingbirds. So not only do I try to attract the butterfly, I love when the hummingbirds also come to visit. And I think it's hard to get a really crisp, clean, red flower in the garden. And that Spagula definitely does it. We've got Ohio, we've got Pennsylvania. Thanks for watching. So as we enter the walkway from the back side of the garden, you can kind of see I did a little bit of a mirror image with the entrance having coneflowers on this side as well. Illinois, Holland, Michigan. Well, you're right in my backyard. This shrub here is the Sonic Bloom Pink Weigela. This is a reblooming weigela. In the spring, it blooms its most prolific blooms. And then usually we'll get about 2 or 3 cycles of blooms throughout the summer. You can see it's just starting to put on some more blooms with the pink. For some reason though, it's interesting. This year, this plant hasn't been as florific as what it has been in years past. So I'm gonna have to do a little research on that to find out why that might be. So not every year does every plant cooperate. So I think that's something important too to note is don't feel like it's you not being able to be a successful gardener. Sometimes plants just aren't having it that year. And that's true too. You could plant a plant and it'll do great for a couple years in your garden. And maybe the 3rd, 4th year, it just kind of peters out. That can happen. We've got some salvia in here, some annual salvia. Annuals are important when planting your garden bed because annuals are the plant that's going to give you constant, consistent color. You know, your shrubs and your perennials cycle. Your annuals are always in color. Beautiful hibiscus there blooming with a nice big dinner plate blooms. Here is a huge plant of Asclepias. This is the Cinderella variety. And I'm starting to notice that some of these seed pods are getting a little bit crisp. So look at that, full of seeds. This is a perfect time to harvest. They haven't started to fly away yet. You can easily collect them. So that's something I would recommend doing. But look at all the seed pods. All those little spikes you're seeing are loaded with seeds. This one plant here is going to produce just thousands of seeds. Every week, every 2 weeks, the gardens are constantly changing. So I think it's always fun to walk through the garden and enjoy what's currently in bloom. I like to say, oh, this is my favorite week in the garden. But then 2 weeks later, I'm coming through and going, well, no, this is my favorite week in the garden. So it's just a constant evolution of color. And I think that is what's great about gardening. I think gardening brings so much joy and happiness to those that do it. Let's not kid ourselves. Gardening is a lot of work. Those of you who do it, you know how much work it is. But you wouldn't be putting the work in if it wasn't bringing you joy. Here is the beautiful Firelight hydrangea, and I think this is my favorite hydrangea in the garden. One of the reasons is because I love the coloration of the blooms. This plant is probably 6, maybe 7 foot tall by about 7 foot wide, and the white blooms are what it starts off. And as you can see, it's starting to transition to its beautiful magenta color. So right now there's a lot of pink hues that are coming through. But as we continue to watch this plant continue to color up, it's going to be almost solid magenta once it gets to its prime. Now, those of you who live in the South, I know some of you are probably envying these hydrangeas right now. I've heard in the South, they'll go from white to brown. You just don't get the beautiful pops of color like we get here in Michigan. And part of that reason I think, is because your nights don't cool off. So in Michigan, our nights cool off once we get to August, and that helps with that transition of color. So it's not anything you're doing wrong. It's just every plant has its prime location, even though they can be grown in many locations. Another thing too is I always tell people, if you have hydrangeas in your garden, make sure that you're getting them enough water, because they do tend to be a thirsty plant. Another corner of the garden that people, I think, really admire when I do these tours is my hosta corner. So we don't have a lot of shade in this garden. It's mostly full sun, but this back corner here stays fairly shady until late in the afternoon. So this is my space where I can put hostas and or any shade plant varieties. Hi, Leah. Yes, this is the first time I've done a live stream. Garden. My thoughts on hostas 25, 30 years ago. I did not like hostas. Reason being is my grandparents had hostas, all the same hosta, and it lined every single garden border in their yard. My mom got some from them, and therefore she lined every garden border in her yard with that same hosta. To my knowledge, there was only one kind of hosta, and that's the one that was lining every garden in my mom and my grandparents' garden. Well, once we got into the greenhouses and gardening, well, looky here. There are hundreds of thousands of hosta varieties. And look what you can do when you just plant one of a variety. You create an absolutely gorgeous patchwork of color that is nothing like my hosta memories are of. So when we planted this garden, we took size, texture, leaf color, all the things in mind, and just kind of created a patchwork of color. So in addition to hostas in this garden, we have some coleus, which that's giving just a little bit of contrast, breaking up the blues, greens, and yellows a little bit. And I think that's needed. We've also planted caladiums in this garden in the past, just to add a little bit of reds in. We also, for spring color, have some Pulmonaria and Bernera. This beautiful chartreuse splash of loveliness. This is the Aurelia Sun King, which is a little bit bigger than some of the hostas and just adds in a little bit different color and texture. So there's a lot of fun things I've learned that you can do with hostas when you don't just share the same hosta over and over again. As we make the way, we're getting into a little bit more sun. It's still shady now though, because it's noon right now, or just a little bit past noon. But once the sun gets up and over these trees, this garden will be in sun from probably 1, 2 o'clock until sunfall. So this garden is lined with a mixture of hot pink sun patiens and white sun patiens. This was not intentional, but we didn't plant the right amount of white, so we weren't able to create a solid white border back here. Oops, guess what? We needed to plan better for next year. Although this looks fine, it's not the look I was going for. It's okay, right? You learn from your mistakes, and sometimes mistakes create beautiful spaces as well. So in this garden, as we transition into a little bit more sun, we're still doing a little bit of the hostas that can handle full sun. There's some Bernera, a Stilby. Now these things aren't blooming right now, but those are some of the colors that are in this space. Bleeding Heart, Lenten Rose, some grasses. And then we did do a few tall phlox because I feel like this garden space is just a little lackluster for color. Like I feel like we need to get a few more bold pops of color. There's a lot of white in here, a lot of green, which those are fine, but we need some more pinks, purples, reds, a few more hot things in here that will really draw attention to this back garden space. Some more bobo hydrangeas, we just kind of tuck them in anywhere. I did just mention that Firelight is my favorite hydrangea, and that's for, a big hydrangea. But there is a new one, and I don't have any planted in my garden yet here. I do at the greenhouse, and that's the Firelight Tidbit. It's only about 2.5 foot tall, 2.5 foot wide. So it's a nice compact hydrangea that is just a nice splash of color that you can tuck into your perennial beds, and it doesn't really take them over. There's a few anemones starting to bloom back here, so we do get some little shots of pink there with the anemone. But I need something earlier in the season to give me more pokes of color. A red, I believe that is the Valentine Crush hardy hibiscus back there. Some phlox, so you see we're starting to get a little bit more color as we're heading this way. Allium Serendipity, always a great selection. Big, bold, whimsy, fun flowers. Sprinklers are going on back there. This corner of the garden was in its prime a couple weeks ago. There's a lot of daylilies just flowering. I do like to take flowers and group similar varieties together. So like I had the hosta corner, I have a daylily patch here, I had a coneflower patch of color, just mixing all the different colors within a family of plants together. The thing in the back there is a garden shed that is meant to look like an outhouse. It's really pretty, especially in the winter time when there's all snow on the ground. That's the only pop of color that we have in the garden. Without getting too close to the sprinklers, we do have a bobo hydrangea there. There's a few more of the big dinner plate bloom hardy hibiscus in the back. You're seeing the red and the pink. There's the incredible hydrangea back there. There's also the real pink blooms just dancing there in the breeze. And then you can see kind of the spent blooms in front of it. We have a lime, but when it was just phenomenal. Up front here. And you can see these are in more sun, so they're a little bit more past their prime than the Serendipity were that were more in that shady location. Here's a plant that I think is not talked about near enough. This is a proudberry shrub. This is a pollinator's dream. I love all of these beautiful pink berries that this plant produces. And these berries are going to last well into the winter. The birds may eat them. But look at this. Isn't this gorgeous? It gets little white flowers on it. And then as those white flowers turn to berries, you're seeing these little clusters. Maybe it's kind of blurry. But they're just starting to berry with those beautiful pink blooms. And there's a ton of green berries on here that aren't even coloring up yet. But look at that. Isn't that some unique coloration in the garden? I'm reading here a comment. How do you plant for west sun with half shade on the lower half of my garden? So I would probably plant using part sun perennials or annuals in that space. Although you may find that full sun plants will do fine if you're westward facing, because your west sun is your most intense sun of the day. So if you have minimal sun, let's say you have 5 hours of sun, your west sun is going to be a much more powerful sun than 5 hours of east or morning sun. So keep that in mind. You know, you can definitely stretch the odds a little bit if you have half a day of south or west facing sun. Another hibiscus here in bloom, some more phlox. This here is a clematis wall. I guess we do have a few things blooming here. We've got some clematis ragucci, which is the purple, Princess Diana, which is the pink. The burgundy is Montana Maline. There was some white, which was Candida on here. But that ragucci clematis, that's the longest blooming clematis I would have to say I personally have in my garden. And it's so unique. It's not the type of clematis that you think of when you think of clematis, because it's not that big circular flower. It's these cute little royal purple dangling bells. So pretty. So here's an experiment I did in my garden last year. We carry Alstroemeria. We talked about the Inca Ice earlier, which is hardy in Michigan. We also have a bunch of the Inca series that are not hardy. So these are zones 7 and 8 plants. So hardy in zones like 7 to 9, 7 to 10. But I planted them last year in my garden as an annual and hoping, fingers crossed, that they would come back. Look at here. All of these Alstroemeria, zone 7 or 8, and I'm a zone 5B, 6A, came back. The red, the orange, the yellow, the purple. Some more red. All of these gorgeous plants. Now these are only about 12 to 18 inches tall, where that Inca Ice is more like 36 inches tall. But this is another plant that is blooming all summer long. So this is a case of go ahead and test your garden zone. If you're a zone 5, try some zone 6. If you're a zone 7, try some zone 8, etc. You may not be successful, but man, when you are, it gives so much satisfaction that you were able to push the zone and push the odds. It is going to depend a little bit on what your winters are like. If you have a hard winter, you're not going to be as successful as if it's a milder winter. So that's, a variable to keep in mind. But man, this was a huge surprise to me, and I'm so excited about it. Some sedum. It's also important when you're planting your garden that you're thinking of seasons, something that blooms in April, May, June, July, August, September. Because if you're planting for one season, or not one season, but 1 month, your garden is going to look very, I'm sorry, but boring. So keep in mind planting things that are blooming throughout the summer so that you're constantly having a cycle of color. And then those annuals will give you that consistent pop of color for when your perennials are cycling. This here is a limelight hydrangea. This limelight hydrangea, if you follow me on YouTube, I did a video last fall. I trimmed this back to about 2 foot tall. Before we please hit the subscribe button. That is so helpful for me and helps me with doing more videos. So please hit subscribe right now if you can do that. So this limelight hydrangea, we did a video on last fall where we trimmed it back to about 18 inches, 24 inches or so. This is an 8-foot plant. I knew by trimming it back that I knew I'd be successful because I've done this 3 different times over the past 20 years. But it was also scary trimming a huge plant back to about 2 foot tall. But I knew by doing so, I was gonna have not as many blooms this year, but the blooms that I had, they were going to be extra large. And that is definitely the case. There's definitely not as many blooms, but let's go in and take a look at these extra large blooms. How many of you feel it's scary to trim plants back, specifically shrubs? Like, does that give you a little bit of fear? Are you afraid it's gonna kill your plant? I know there's a lot of you out there that it brings fear to. My little motto is if you have a shrub that you're not in love with, trim it. Worst case scenario, you're gonna kill it. That might be a blessing. Best case scenario, it's gonna come back and look lovely. So just don't be satisfied with something that looks okay. Do something about it. Trim it and see what happens. So this particular flower, I'm going to put my hand kind of there at the top of it, is about 12 inches, if not longer. And it's about probably 8 inches or so wide. So an extra large limelight bloom. So what happened is it doesn't have a lot of flowers. It has one giant flower. But this one giant flower is made up of smaller flowers. So you can see how there's these little flowers. So it pushed all the flowers to the tip of the plant to create one giant bloom. So it's always fun that first year after trimming just to see what your blooms will do. And in this case, they are absolutely huge. A few more things in this garden. This garden was recently planted. It's not my most prized possession or area of my garden because it's kind of growing into its own at this point. But a few things we're seeing in front of us here are some coneflowers. Stokesia, I love Stokesia. It's a great late summer bloomer that once it starts blooming, it blooms for a long time into the fall. We have an incredible hydrangea. And then on this side here, we kind of repeated what was on the other side there. But at the end here, we followed it out with one of the big, huge hibiscus with the big, huge dinner plate blooms. So we're gonna go walk over here to this firelight hydrangea and give you a couple minutes for those of you that are watching. Thanks for walking through the garden with me today. Like I said, this is my first live YouTube video, so I'm not sure how it's actually gonna look when I go back and watch it after the fact. So thanks for those of you who have walked through the garden and have been commenting below. So if you have any quick questions, we'll do maybe a couple questions and help answer any that you may have. All right, let's see. My bobo got broken a bit from workers. Flowers are huge, but some flopping. Should I prune late fall about 1/3? Yes, that is a great idea. Go ahead and enjoy the blooms that are blooming right now. No sense to cut them off. Go ahead, let them bloom, enjoy them. And then in the fall, once your garden's kind of ready to be put to sleep, trimming by 1/3 is a good rule of thumb. That's kind of every year, trim by 1/3. And you know, they'll be great. If you feel like you have to do more drastic because they broke a lot of the lower branches and stuff, go ahead and feel comfortable to trim even more off. But a good rule of thumb is trimming by about 1/3 every season. Anyone else that's watching have any questions? Zone. We are in West Michigan. We are a zone 5B, 6A. And why do I say it like that? Basically, I say it like that because different years, we kind of can run a little bit different. I also say it like that because in my garden, especially where we just walked through, I have a lot of different little microclimates. There's a creek that runs along the back of the property. So that creek is natural, a spring-fed creek. So that can kind of keep the temperatures just a little bit warmer in the winter. So if I put a little zone 7 things back there, sometimes I can be successful. Not always, but sometimes. So there's just different little microclimates here in the garden. What was the favorite flower that you saw in today's garden tour? All right, so somebody just asked about where the best place is to plant the yin and the yang viburnum in zone 7B in Alabama. I'm afraid of losing them in the winter. So I guess, what is your fear of losing them? Are you afraid that you're going to be too hot or too cold? You definitely are not gonna be too cold. Planting in Alabama, I think you should be fine planting them anywhere. So you really, I don't think, have to worry about planting them in the right spot. The hydrangeas definitely are coming through as things people are liking. Panicle hydrangeas. You definitely can't go wrong with panicle hydrangeas because, like I said, they bloom off of the new growth, and there are so many people who are scared of hydrangeas because they've planted the big leaf before and they didn't bloom for them. But if you plant the panicle hydrangeas or the arborescent hydrangeas, those really are the no-fail hydrangeas. They bloom and they'll be successful. Alstroemeria, that's always one that's a standout in the garden. The white sun patiens, yes. We've done, so in the past, we used to line the back of the garden with super petunias, which are fabulous. But the thing with the super petunias back there is they needed a lot of fertilizer. And to get fertilizer back in the back of the garden here, it was hard to do. So several years ago, we switched over to the Sun Patience, and they have just done a lot better for us with a lot less work as far as worrying about fertilizing. Because like I said, Sun Patience don't need fertilizer. If you are in or want to take a trip to Zeeland, Michigan, we do have our retail garden center. We are a Proven Winner signature garden, and we have fabulous gardens at the garden center. So we invite you to come on by anytime and walk through the gardens. Our staff is there at the garden center. They can help answer any questions you have. It's a beautiful, beautiful display garden where you can see all of your favorite annuals, perennials, and shrubs. So one thing I should point out about Garden Crossings is Garden Crossings, I believe, is the only online and or retail garden center that carries every single Proven Winner annual, perennial, and shrub. So we are a destination nonstop shop for all your favorite Proven Winner plants. New Mexico, you can't grow hydrangeas. I can believe that. It's probably a little bit hot maybe where you're at. Sun Patience, can't go wrong. Learning about the moon gardens. Moon gardens definitely are where you're adding a lot of white into the garden and it just glows in the night. Should you ever trim your tough stuff? Aha. So the answer is yes, and the answer is no. Yes, you're gonna need to trim that tough stuff, aha, because at some point it's gonna get big and you're just gonna wanna dial it back in. So you can go ahead and trim that tough stuff, aha, in the fall. You will be sacrificing your early season blooms, but not to fear, you should get your secondary flush of blooms later on in the summer. Sometimes you have to sacrifice the initial blooms on those big leaf hydrangeas or tough stuff hydrangeas to get your plant back down to the size you want it to, because it can get big over time. Let's see. All right, having a hard time with smooth hydrangeas. I'm guessing you're probably in a warmer zone. They also need a lot of water. A couple people watching from Canada. That's pretty cool. Thanks for watching. Let's see. Okay, you've got macrophyllus, but your smooth hydrangeas aren't doing good. Maybe you can send us an email and I can take a look at pictures and give you some suggestions if your plants aren't doing good with what maybe might be going on. Dusty Miller, that comes back every year. I'm not surprised, in a zone 5B. That is one of those that can sometimes come back. So Anne is guessing pink is my favorite color. So it's kind of funny. My favorite color actually is purple or blue. But there is a lot of pink flowers, and we have a lot of pink in the garden just because, I don't know, I feel like it's easier to find pink flowers. The moon plant becomes a nuisance. I don't actually have any moon plants in my garden. It's a moon garden in some places, but I don't have moon plants. I was just talking to somebody about those recently, and they said they do reseed themselves. So. Is trimming hydrangeas in the fall better than late winter? I usually trim mine in October here in Michigan. I think it kind of depends where you're at. Late winter for us would be way too cold. We'd freeze doing it. So we like to do it in like October. If you're from Indiana, definitely head out to the garden center. It'll be a little drive, but well worth your trip. Do we trim our buddleia to the ground in the spring? I did, and only 1 of 3 grew back. So it's going to depend on your hardiness zone. So us being in zone 5, the best recommendation for us is to leave the butterfly bush and trim them in the spring, seeing where the new growth is coming from. I don't have time in the spring, so we trim most of ours back in the fall just because of lack of time in the spring. It does take longer for them to come back in the spring because they're coming back from the ground at that point. But here, for us personally, we've been successful trimming them back in the fall. What's a good alternative to silver mound Artemisia? So silver mound is a silvery little mound. beautiful little plant only gets maybe 8 to 10 inches tall, 12 inches wide. It's not going to be the same color, but I would recommend lemon coral sedum, or really kind of any sedum, depending on what you're going for that look. I've heard honeysuckle, or is honeysuckle invasive? Not in our gardens here in zone 5. We've not noticed it to be invasive. I have heard in some areas that they do say it's invasive. So it's going to depend on where you live and also the variety of honeysuckle that you're planting. I am not jealous of Meep, where it's 109 today. It's probably 75 here in Michigan today, and I'm probably already glistening just a little bit. All right, we'll take just a couple more questions and then I think we'll call it a day. Like I said, if you're new to our YouTube channel, I have a ton of videos out there that you can go back and watch of the gardens here at my home. We have a northern Michigan garden. We also have the gardens at the garden center. And I also do go to a lot of the Proven Winter gardens. The Proven Winter perennial garden is local to us. The shrub garden is local to us. So there's a lot of great videos and information on our YouTube channel. And like I said, be sure to subscribe. That helps us out a ton if you do so. Also, if you share these videos with your friends, that's also very helpful. Well, thanks for watching today. I appreciate those that took the last 40 or so minutes to listen to me as we walked through the gardens. I think I'll be able to still post this onto YouTube, even though we won't be live. So for those of you who are catching this after the fact, still feel free to leave comments below. We'll be sure to get to them. Thanks for watching. I'm Heidi from Garden Crossings.